There is a portrait that still hangs in a cold, rarely visited corridor of Ashworth Hall. The paint has darkened with age, the gilt frame has lost its shine, and the staff who dust it every few months rarely stop to look at the face inside it. But if you did stop, if you actually looked, you would see a man with sharp cheekbones, dark hair swept back in the fashion of his day, and eyes that seem to follow you no matter where you stand in the room. That is Duke Nikolai of Ashworth. And for nearly 2 decades, his name was the single most whispered word in every ballroom, every drawing room, every servant's hall, and every scandal sheet from one end of the country to the other. He was brilliant. He was magnetic. He was, by every account that survives him, one of the most captivating men of his generation. And he was, without question, one of the most disgraced. Wherever Duke Nikolai went, ruin seemed to follow a few steps behind him, patient as a shadow, waiting for the right moment to catch up. Marriages crumbled in his wake. Fortunes vanished. Men who called him friend ended up calling him enemy, and sometimes ended up calling for pistols at dawn. And at the center of it all stood a woman who the world assumed was merely his victim. His long-suffering Duchess, Isabella. A woman history remembered, for a very long time, as the quiet, dignified wife who endured her husband's endless scandals with grace. But here is the thing about history, and especially about scandal. The version that survives is rarely the version that happened. And the story of Nikolai and Isabella of Ashworth is, in the end, not a story about a wicked duke and his innocent duchess at all. It is something far stranger, far more tangled, and far more human than that. By the time we reach the end of the story, you may find that everything you assumed in the first 5 minutes was wrong. So settle in, because this is a long one, and every single detail matters. This is the full, true, almost unbelievable story of the scandal that followed the Duke of Ashworth everywhere he went, and the woman who was there for every single moment of it. To understand the scandal, you first have to understand where it started, and it did not start with Nikolai at all. It started a generation earlier with his father, the previous Duke of Ashworth, a cold and exacting man who believed that reputation was the only currency that mattered in the world, and that a single misstep could unravel a family's standing built over 300 years. He raised his only son under that belief like a whip held over his shoulders at all times. Nikolai was taught from the age of 6 that he was not simply a boy, but an institution. He was taught to sit still through hours of tedious visits from minor nobility. He was taught to memorize the genealogies of every family his own might ever need to marry into, ally with, or destroy. He was taught, above all, that emotion was a luxury afforded to lesser men, and that a duke's face should never betray what was happening underneath it. It is worth pausing here, because this detail explains almost everything that follows. Nikolai grew up in a house where affection was rationed like wartime bread. His mother, a soft-spoken woman who by every account adored him, was kept at arm's length by her husband's rigid ideas about how a future duke should be raised. She was permitted to see her son for an hour after supper, and no more. The rest of his day belonged to tutors, fencing masters, and a father who inspected his posture the way other men inspected horses. By the time Nikolai was 15, he had learned to charm a room full of adults twice his age without revealing a flicker of what he actually felt. He had learned, in other words, exactly how to become the man who would later be accused of being incapable of honesty. His father died when Nikolai was 22, collapsing suddenly at his desk while reviewing the estate's ledgers, and just like that, the boy who had spent his whole life being groomed for a role became the man who had to fill it. He inherited a dukedom groaning under debts his father had hidden behind a mask of icy composure. He inherited tenants who depended on him for their livelihoods. He inherited a name that opened every door in the land and, simultaneously, a reputation so exacting that a single failure would be remembered for 100 years. And he inherited, perhaps most dangerously of all, absolutely no practice whatsoever in being an ordinary, flawed, forgivable human being. Those who knew him in those early years, the years right after his father's death, describe a young duke who seemed almost frighteningly composed. He managed the estate's finances with a coldness that impressed the family solicitors. He negotiated with creditors as though he felt nothing at all about the family fortune hanging by a thread. He attended his first season in society not as a nervous young heir eager to find a wife, but as a man conducting an inspection, assessing which families might strengthen his position and which might weaken it. It was, by every measure that mattered to the aristocracy of his time, a masterful performance. But performances have a cost, and Nikolai's came due almost immediately, because underneath that composed exterior was a young man who had never once been allowed to want anything simply because he wanted it. And when a person is denied that most basic human freedom for long enough, something in them eventually breaks loose and demands to be fed. For some people, that hunger shows up as ambition. For others, it becomes cruelty. For Nikolai, it became something the world would eventually call scandal, though at the time, in those early years, it looked more like restlessness. He gambled more than he should have. He drank more than a young duke was supposed to admit to, and he began, very quietly at first, to develop the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. A reputation as a man who could not stay in one place, could not stay attached to one idea, could not, some said, stay attached to one woman. It is important to say here that none of this excuses what came later. A difficult childhood explains a man. It does not absolve him. But if you want to understand why the Duke of Ashworth became the center of the greatest scandal of his era, you cannot start with the scandal itself. You have to start with the boy who was never once allowed to be anything other than perfect, and what that boy became when he was finally given the freedom to be anything at all. Now we turn to Isabella, and here the story takes a very different shape. Where Nikolai was raised inside a fortress of expectation, Isabella was raised almost entirely outside the world she would eventually be thrust into. Her family held a respectable but modest title, an old name with very little money left attached to it, and a small country estate that had seen better centuries. Her father was a gentle, bookish man who preferred his library to society, and her mother had died when Isabella was still a girl, leaving her to be raised largely by her father's sister, an aunt with strong opinions and an even stronger disregard for the rules that were supposed to govern young women of her class. That aunt, more than anyone else, shaped the woman Isabella would become. She taught her niece to read Latin, to argue politics at the dinner table, and to never, under any circumstances, apologize for having an opinion simply because she happened to be female. In an era when young women were expected to be decorative, quiet, and endlessly agreeable, Isabella grew up sharp-tongued, curious, and stubborn in a way that made most eligible bachelors of her acquaintance deeply uncomfortable. She had, more than one suitor complained, an unfortunate habit of asking questions men did not particularly want to answer. By the time she reached the age when a young woman of her station was expected to marry, Isabella had developed something of a reputation herself, though a very different sort from the one that would eventually attach itself to her husband. She was considered clever, which in her social circle was not always meant as a compliment. She was considered independent, which was even less of one, and she had, by her own later admission, resigned herself to the likelihood that she would either marry a dull man who did not notice her sharpness, or remain unmarried entirely and spend her days managing her father's crumbling estate and arguing with his tenants about crop rotation. She did not expect to marry a duke. And she certainly did not expect to fall into the orbit of the most talked-about young nobleman in the country at a ball she had only attended because her aunt insisted it would be good for her nerves. The meeting between Nikolai and Isabella has been recounted so many times, in so many conflicting versions, that it is difficult to know exactly what happened that night. But the version that seems most consistent across the letters and diaries that survive goes something like this. Nikolai, bored and restless as he so often was at these events, had retreated to the edge of the ballroom to avoid yet another conversation about crops or marriage prospects, when he overheard a young woman a few feet away dismantling another guest's argument about a recent parliamentary debate with a precision that most men in the room could not have managed. He did not approach her because she was beautiful, though by most accounts she was. He approached her because he was, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely curious about what she would say next. Isabella, for her part, later wrote to her aunt that she found the Duke of Ashworth insufferable within the first 2 minutes of conversation, and utterly fascinating within the first 10. He did not compliment her, which she found strange and rather refreshing. Instead, he argued with her. He disagreed with nearly everything she said, not out of contempt but out of what seemed like genuine enjoyment of the disagreement itself. It was, she wrote, the first conversation she had ever had with a man of his rank that did not feel like being humored. Within 3 months, the two were engaged. Within 6, they were married, in a ceremony that the newspapers of the time described as one of the grandest the county had seen in a generation. And for a brief, shining period afterward, it seemed as though the story might simply end there, with a clever young woman and a brilliant young duke building a partnership that the rest of society could only envy. Letters from that first year of marriage show two people genuinely delighted by each other's company, trading jokes and arguments in equal measure, each one seemingly certain they had found something rare. But you already know, because I told you at the very beginning, that this is not how the story goes. Somewhere in that first year, something shifted. And to understand what happened next, we need to talk about the first scandal, the one that would set the pattern for every single one that followed. It began, as these things so often do, with something small enough that almost no one noticed it at first. A missed dinner, a letter that arrived late, a rumor passed between 2 servants and then 2 more, about the Duke's extended absences from Ashworth Hall during the early months of his marriage. On their own, none of these things would have amounted to much. Dukes traveled. Business called men away from their estates all the time, and no one thought twice about a husband spending long stretches in the city while his wife managed the household in the country. But the frequency of Nikolai's absences began to raise eyebrows among those closest to the family, and eventually among those not close to the family at all. The story that eventually surfaced, and it took nearly a year to fully surface, was this. During one of his trips to the capital, ostensibly to handle matters related to the estate's finances, Nikolai had been seen repeatedly in the company of a well-known actress, a woman whose name was already familiar to fashionable society for reasons that had nothing to do with her talent on stage. At first, the sightings were dismissed as coincidence or exaggeration, or the kind of malicious gossip that attached itself to any prominent man. But the sightings continued, and eventually, a letter, allegedly written in Nikolai's own hand and addressed to the actress in terms that left very little to the imagination, found its way into the possession of a gossip columnist who made his living exposing exactly this kind of indiscretion. The letter was never published in full. Even in an era with far looser standards around what could be printed about the aristocracy, there were limits, and a married duke's private correspondence with an actress was considered, at least by the editors of the more respectable papers, a step too far to reproduce word for word. But excerpts circulated. Rumors of its contents spread through drawing rooms faster than any printed page could have carried them. And within weeks, the entire fashionable world knew, or believed they knew, that the Duke of Ashworth, married less than a year, had already been unfaithful to his clever, celebrated young wife. Isabella's response to this first scandal is, in many ways, the key to understanding everything that came afterward, because it was almost nothing like what society expected. She did not weep publicly. She did not retreat to the country in humiliated seclusion, as a wronged wife of her era was supposed to do. Instead, she appeared at the very next social event on the calendar, dressed, according to one witness, more magnificently than anyone had ever seen her, and spent the entire evening in cheerful, animated conversation with everyone in the room except her husband. She did not deny the rumors. She did not confirm them either. She simply refused to perform the role of humiliated victim that society had already written for her. And in doing so, she confused absolutely everyone. Some in society read this as extraordinary dignity. Others read it as coldness, evidence that perhaps the marriage had been a loveless arrangement from the start, and that Isabella did not care enough about her husband to be genuinely wounded by his betrayal. Both interpretations, as it turns out, were wrong, though it would take years for the truth to emerge. What actually happened, according to letters Isabella wrote to her aunt during this period and only made public decades later, was far more complicated than either humiliation or indifference. She was furious. She was heartbroken. And she was also, in a way she found difficult to admit even to herself, unwilling to let her husband's mistake define the rest of her life in front of an audience that would have delighted in watching her fall apart. When she finally confronted Nikolai privately, weeks after the scandal had died down in public, the conversation that followed was not the tearful reconciliation or the explosive argument that either of them might have expected. According to Isabella's own later account, Nikolai did not deny the affair, and he did not offer the kind of empty apology that men in his position so often relied on. Instead, He told her something that she found, in her words, both infuriating and strangely honest. He told her that he did not fully understand why he had done it, that the actress had meant nothing to him beyond a distraction he had reached for without thinking, the way a man reaches for a drink he does not particularly want simply because it is there. He told her that he had never, in his entire life, been taught how to sit still with a feeling he did not like, and that being married to a woman as sharp and observant as Isabella had, for reasons he could not fully articulate, made him feel exposed in a way he found unbearable. It was not an excuse. Isabella made that clear in her letters. But it was, she wrote, the first time her husband had ever told her something true about himself instead of something calculated to manage her reaction. And so, against the advice of nearly everyone around her, including her own aunt, Isabella made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She decided to stay, not because she had forgiven him, not fully, not yet, but because she had glimpsed, underneath the scandal, a man who was genuinely, desperately lost, and she found that she was not yet ready to walk away from the puzzle of him. This decision, more than anything else, is what set the pattern for the next 2 decades. Because the actress was not the last scandal. She was only the first. If the affair with the actress had been an isolated incident, this would be a much shorter story, and probably a much less interesting one. But it was not isolated. Over the following years, a pattern began to emerge, one that society watched with a mixture of horror and, if we are being honest about human nature, considerable entertainment. The Duke of Ashworth developed a habit of becoming entangled in scandal after scandal, each one slightly different in its particulars but eerily similar in its shape. There would be a period of calm, sometimes lasting a year or more, during which Nikolai seemed to have settled into the responsibilities of his position, managing the estate, attending to Parliament, appearing at his wife's side at public functions with every appearance of contentment. And then, without warning, something would happen that dragged his name back into disgrace. There was the incident with the young widow, a woman of considerable fortune and even more considerable ambition, who Nikolai was rumored to have courted in secret while Isabella was confined to the country during a difficult pregnancy. There was the enormous gambling debt he accumulated over the course of a single disastrous winter, a debt so large that it required Isabella's own dowry, carefully preserved and invested by her father before his death, to settle it quietly before the family's creditors could make it public. There was the duel, perhaps the most famous of all these incidents, fought at dawn against a fellow nobleman who accused Nikolai of improper conduct toward his sister, a duel that ended without bloodshed but that dominated the gossip columns for months afterward, with wildly varying accounts of exactly what Nikolai had or had not done to provoke it. Each of these incidents, taken alone, might have been survivable. Aristocratic society of the era was, whatever its public moralizing, remarkably willing to forgive a great deal from a man with sufficient rank and fortune. A single affair could be forgotten. A single gambling debt could be absorbed. A single duel could even, in certain circles, enhance a man's reputation rather than damage it, provided he conducted himself with sufficient honor in the moment. But the accumulation of incident after incident, year after year, began to create something more dangerous than any single scandal could have on its own. It began to create a narrative. And once a man becomes a narrative, every new event, however small, gets absorbed into the story that already exists about him, whether or not it actually belongs there. This is a crucial point, and one that most tellings of this story miss entirely. Because as the years went on, it became almost impossible to distinguish between the scandals that Nikolai actually caused and the scandals that were simply attributed to him because his reputation made him an easy target. There were rumors of affairs that later evidence suggests never happened at all, invented by rivals eager to damage the Ashworth name, or simply exaggerated from innocent encounters by a gossip machine that had learned it could sell papers simply by attaching the Duke's name to any hint of impropriety. There were debts blamed on him that were later traced back to his late father's mismanagement rather than his own. There was even, in one particularly striking case, an entire scandal involving a supposed illegitimate child that was later proven, through careful investigation by the family's own solicitors, to have been fabricated entirely by a disgruntled former steward seeking to extort money from the estate. None of this means Nikolai was innocent. He was not. Many of the scandals attached to his name were entirely, undeniably true, confirmed by his own admissions in private letters that survive to this day. But the story of the Duke of Ashworth is not simply the story of a bad man behaving badly for 20 years. It is the story of how reputation, once it calcifies into legend, takes on a life of its own, growing and multiplying independent of the facts that first created it. By the midpoint of his life, Nikolai could not attend a public event, could not travel to a new town, could not even be seen speaking privately with any woman who was not his wife, without some version of the story reaching the papers within days. He had become, in the truest sense of the phrase, a scandal that followed him everywhere he went, not because every scandal was real, but because the world had decided he was the kind of man scandals happened to, and the world, once it decides something like that, rarely bothers to check its facts before repeating them. And through every single one of these episodes, real and invented alike, Isabella remained. Not silent, not passive, not the quietly suffering wife of popular imagination, but present, watching, and increasingly, as we will see, playing a far more active role in the story than anyone at the time understood. Here is where the story that most people have heard begins to diverge sharply from what actually happened, because for 200 years, the popular version of this tale has cast Isabella as a tragic, passive figure, a woman of great dignity who endured her husband's endless indiscretions with quiet suffering and said nothing. It is a compelling image. It is also, according to the letters, ledgers, and private accounts that have survived and been studied by historians far more diligently than any gossip columnist of the era bothered to, almost entirely false. The truth is that Isabella was, from very early in the marriage, one of the most capable managers of crisis that the aristocracy of her time ever produced. While Nikolai's name was being dragged through scandal sheet after scandal sheet, it was Isabella who was quietly, methodically working behind the scenes to contain the damage, protect the family's finances, and in more than one instance manufacture explanations that redirected public attention away from the truth entirely. She did not do this out of blind loyalty or naive devotion. She did it, according to her own later writings, because she had made a calculated decision that the survival of the Ashworth name, and more importantly the survival of the tenants and servants and dependents whose livelihoods relied on that name remaining solvent and respected, mattered more than her own wounded pride. Consider the gambling debt we mentioned earlier, the one that nearly bankrupted the family during that disastrous winter. The popular story, repeated in countless retellings since, is that Isabella discovered the debt after the fact and was forced to sacrifice her own dowry to save her husband from ruin, a tragic sacrifice imposed upon her by his recklessness. The actual correspondence tells a very different story. Isabella had, in fact, been aware of her husband's gambling for months before the debt reached its crisis point, and had been quietly attempting to intervene through channels her husband never knew about, including a private arrangement with one of the gaming houses he frequented, in which she paid a discreet sum to have her husband's credit limits secretly restricted without his knowledge. It was an intervention that, by her own admission, only partially worked, but it demonstrates something the traditional story never accounts for. Isabella was not a passive bystander to her husband's chaos. She was actively, strategically managing it, often more effectively than he ever managed it himself. Or consider the fabricated scandal involving the supposed illegitimate child, the one invented by a disgruntled steward hoping to extort the family. In the popular telling, this scandal was uncovered and disproven by the family's solicitors. Full stop, end of story. What that telling leaves out entirely is that it was Isabella who first grew suspicious of the steward's claims. Isabella who quietly hired an independent investigator without her husband's knowledge to verify the timeline the steward had presented, and Isabella who ultimately presented the solicitors with evidence so thorough that the steward's scheme collapsed within a matter of weeks rather than dragging on for the months or years such scandals typically took to resolve. Nikolai, by his own later admission in a letter to a close friend, did not even fully understand how quickly and cleanly the matter had been handled until well after it was over. Why does this matter? Why does it matter whether Isabella was a passive victim or an active participant in managing her husband's chaos? It matters because it changes the entire moral shape of the story. A tale about a wicked man and his suffering wife is simple. It has a villain and a victim, and the audience knows exactly how to feel about each of them. But a tale about a deeply flawed, self-destructive man and a fiercely intelligent, strategic woman who chose, again and again, to stay and manage the consequences of his flaws rather than walk away from them, that is a far more complicated story, and a far more honest one. It asks harder questions. Why did she stay? What did she get out of an arrangement that cost her so much dignity in the public eye? Was she a fool for staying? Or was she something else entirely? A woman who understood the game of reputation and survival better than anyone else in her orbit, including her own husband? The answer, as it so often is with real human beings rather than the flattened versions of them that history prefers to remember, is complicated. And to understand it fully, we need to look at the years when the scandal reached its absolute peak, the years when the Duke of Ashworth's name became not just a topic of gossip but something closer to a national obsession. Every scandal-plagued life seems to have one year that stands above all the others, the year when every simmering tension finally boils over at once. And for Nikolai and Isabella, that year came almost exactly a decade into their marriage. It began, innocuously enough, with an invitation to a house party at the estate of a prominent political family, the kind of gathering where alliances were formed, marriages were arranged, and reputations were made or broken over the course of a single long weekend. Nikolai, by this point a respected if controversial figure in Parliament, attended in part to shore up support for a piece of legislation he had been championing, and Isabella accompanied him, as she nearly always did by this stage in their marriage, less out of romantic devotion than out of a shared understanding that her presence at his side was, quite simply, good strategy. It was at this house party that Nikolai became entangled in what would become the most damaging scandal of his entire life, one that very nearly ended his marriage, his political career, and his standing in society all at once. The details, even now, remain somewhat disputed, but the broad outline is this. A young woman attending the party, the daughter of a family with significant political influence, was found in circumstances that strongly suggested an improper encounter with Nikolai, late at night, in a wing of the house that guests were not supposed to enter unaccompanied. The young woman's family, furious and humiliated, threatened to make the matter public in the most damaging way possible, potentially ruining not only Nikolai's reputation but the young woman's own marriage prospects in the process. What makes this scandal different from every other one in Nikolai's long history of scandals is what happened next, because for the first time, Isabella did not move to protect her husband. She moved, instead, to investigate what had actually happened, and what she discovered changed the entire trajectory of the story. According to Isabella's private journals, which were only discovered and published by historians nearly a century later, she spent the days following the incident conducting her own quiet inquiry, speaking to servants, comparing timelines, and eventually confronting the young woman at the center of the scandal directly, woman to woman, away from the men who were busy shouting at each other about honor and reputation. What she uncovered was not the affair that everyone assumed had taken place. It was something considerably more disturbing. The young woman confessed to Isabella that she had been pressured, not by Nikolai but by her own family, to manufacture the appearance of an encounter with the Duke of Ashworth specifically because his reputation made him the perfect target. If a scandal involving Nikolai became public, her family reasoned, no one would question it because everyone already believed him capable of exactly this kind of behavior. And once the scandal broke, her family intended to use it as leverage, extracting a substantial financial settlement from the Ashworth estate in exchange for their silence. A settlement they desperately needed to cover debts of their own that had nothing to do with Nikolai at all. This is, perhaps, the single most important revelation in the entire history of the Ashworth scandal, because it demonstrates with painful clarity exactly what we discussed earlier. That Nikolai's reputation had become so thoroughly established, so deeply embedded in the public imagination, that it made him vulnerable to exploitation by anyone clever enough to use it against him. He had become, in a very real sense, a scandal waiting to happen in the eyes of the world, regardless of whether any particular scandal was real. And this made him an irresistible target for anyone with a grievance, a debt, or an ambition that could be served by attaching his name to their own schemes. Isabella, armed with the young woman's confession and the corroborating testimony of two servants she had carefully, quietly interviewed, confronted the young woman's family directly, without her husband present, and without informing him of what she had discovered until after the matter was resolved. She made it clear, in terms that survive in her own handwriting, that she possessed sufficient evidence to expose their scheme publicly, ruining their family's reputation far more thoroughly than any scandal involving her husband ever could, and that she was entirely prepared to do so unless they abandoned their extortion attempt immediately and permanently. Faced with a woman who had clearly outmaneuvered them at their own game, the family backed down within days. When Nikolai finally learned what his wife had done, according to a letter he wrote to a friend shortly afterward, he was, in his own words, humbled in a way he had never been humbled before. Not because his innocence had been proven, though it had, but because he realized, for the first time in 10 years of marriage, exactly how much his wife had been carrying on his behalf, quietly, without credit, without acknowledgement, for longer than he had ever bothered to notice. It was, by his own account, the moment he began to understand that the woman he had married was not merely someone he needed to manage or explain himself to, but someone considerably more formidable than he was, in every way that mattered. Unfortunately, understanding this did not immediately change his behavior. Old patterns, especially patterns built over a lifetime of never being taught how to sit with an uncomfortable feeling, do not dissolve simply because a man has one moment of clarity. And the scandals, though they would never again reach quite the fever pitch of that house party, continued. By this point in our story, it's worth pausing to talk about something that made the entire situation more complicated and more painful than a simple recounting of individual scandals can capture, and that is the role the press and public gossip played in amplifying and distorting every single thing that happened to this family. We take for granted today the idea of a 24-hour news cycle obsessed with celebrity misbehavior, but the appetite for exactly this kind of story existed just as ravenously in Nikolai and Isabella's era, simply through different mechanisms. Gossip columns, satirical prints, and the endless churn of drawing-room conversation served the same function that tabloids and social media serve today, and the Duke of Ashworth was, for the better part of 2 decades, one of the most reliable sources of content that Machine ever had. This mattered enormously because it meant that Isabella was not simply managing her husband's actual behavior, she was managing the public perception of that behavior, which was very often a wildly exaggerated, distorted, or entirely fictional version of events. Satirical prints depicted Nikolai in caricature, engaged in behavior that had no basis in reality whatsoever, purely because it made for an entertaining image. Gossip columnists, competing with each other for readers, learned that they could publish almost any claim about the Duke of Ashworth without fear of consequence, because the public was so primed to believe the worst of him that no one bothered to demand evidence. Isabella's private correspondence from this period reveals a woman growing increasingly exhausted, not by her husband's actual misdeeds, which were burden enough, but by the endless task of separating truth from fiction in the public narrative, and deciding, case by case, which battles were worth fighting publicly and which were better left to die quietly through simple non-engagement. She developed, over the years, a set of principles for this that she described in a letter to her aunt with something approaching dark humor. Never respond to an accusation that will fade on its own within a fortnight, she wrote, because responding only extends its life. But always respond, swiftly and with overwhelming evidence, to any accusation that touches the family's finances or the legitimacy of the succession, because those are the only 2 subjects the public genuinely cares about resolving rather than simply enjoying the drama of. This strategic thinking, more than anything her husband ever did or said, is what ultimately preserved the Ashworth name through 2 decades of relentless scandal. And it came at a cost that the public of her era never saw and never particularly cared to consider. Isabella, the sharp, argumentative, independent young woman who had once delighted in disagreeing with everyone in a ballroom simply for the pleasure of the argument, gradually became something more guarded, more careful, more calculating in every public interaction. Friends from her youth remarked, in letters that survive, that the Duchess of Ashworth they encountered in her 30s bore only a passing resemblance to the girl they had known before her marriage. She had grown, in the words of one old friend, formidable, in a way that commanded respect but occasionally made her difficult to feel close to. This is, perhaps, the most quietly tragic element of the entire story, more tragic in some ways than any individual scandal her husband generated. Isabella did not simply endure her husband's chaos. She was fundamentally reshaped by the necessity of managing it, transformed from a curious, open young woman into a controlled, strategic operator who had learned, through hard experience, that vulnerability was a luxury she could no longer afford. Whatever else we say about Nikolai's failings, and there were many, this transformation in his wife represents a cost that historians have only recently begun to fully reckon with, a cost that the popular, simplified version of this story, with its villain and its silently suffering saint, never adequately captures. And yet, remarkably, the marriage did not end. Divorce, though technically possible for the aristocracy of the era through an extraordinarily difficult and expensive process requiring an act of legislation, was so socially catastrophic, particularly for the wife, that it was rarely pursued even in marriages far more miserable than theirs. But social pressure alone does not fully explain why Isabella stayed for as long as she did, particularly given how capable, independent, and financially astute she had proven herself to be. To understand why she stayed, we need to look at what was actually happening between the two of them in private, away from the scandals, away from the gossip columns, in the quiet moments that history rarely bothers to record. For nearly 200 years, the private correspondence between Nikolai and Isabella remained locked away in the family archives at Ashworth Hall, inaccessible to the public and rarely examined even by the family's own historians. It was only within the last several decades, when descendants of the Ashworth line finally opened the archive to academic researchers, that the full picture of this marriage began to emerge, and what those letters reveal complicates nearly everything the public believed about this couple for 2 centuries. The letters show, first and foremost, that whatever else was true about their marriage, Nikolai and Isabella genuinely loved each other, in a complicated, difficult, often painful way that does not fit neatly into either the fairy tale or the tragedy that popular history has alternately cast their story as. Nikolai's letters to Isabella, particularly those written during his absences, are filled with a kind of raw, searching honesty that he apparently could not manage in any other context. In one letter, written after a particularly public scandal involving a woman he had been seen dining with in the capital, he wrote to his wife not to deny the rumors or beg forgiveness, but to try, haltingly and imperfectly, to explain the compulsion that drove him toward these situations again and again, a compulsion he described as feeling most alive precisely in the moments when he was doing something he knew would eventually cause pain, as though the anticipation of consequence was the only thing that could cut through a numbness he had felt for as long as he could remember. This is not an excuse, and it is worth saying again clearly. Nothing in these letters excuses the pain Nikolai caused, both to Isabella and to the other people, the actress, the young widow, and others whose names have not survived history's attention, who were drawn into his orbit and then discarded or exposed as collateral damage in his ongoing crisis. But the letters do offer something the popular narrative has always lacked: a genuine, if deeply flawed, human being underneath the caricature of the scandalous Duke, a man who seemed to understand, at least in his more honest moments, that he was causing harm, and who seemed genuinely unable to stop himself from causing it anyway. Isabella's letters, meanwhile, reveal an evolution in her own thinking about the marriage that took place over many years and cannot be reduced to a single explanation. In her early letters, particularly those written in the years immediately following the actress scandal, she frames her decision to stay largely in strategic terms: protecting the family, protecting the tenants, refusing to give society the satisfaction of watching her collapse. But her later letters, particularly those written after the house party incident when she discovered the extortion scheme, reveal something more personal. She writes, in one particularly striking passage to her aunt, that she had come to believe her husband was, in her words, a man perpetually drowning in a river only he could see, and that while she could not save him from the river, she had discovered that she did not actually want to let go of his hand while he struggled in it, however exhausting that struggle had become for her as well. This is, I think, the emotional center of the entire story, the piece that gets lost every time the scandal is retold as a simple tale of a wicked husband and his martyred wife. Isabella did not stay because she was weak or naive or trapped by social convention, though social convention certainly made leaving harder than it should have been. She stayed because she had made a clear-eyed, adult decision that she loved a deeply flawed man, that she found meaning and even a strange kind of partnership in the ongoing work of managing the consequences of his flaws, and that this arrangement, however unconventional and however costly, was one she chose again and again rather than one that was simply imposed upon her. Does this make the story less scandalous? In some ways, yes. It removes the simple moral clarity that makes gossip so satisfying to consume. But it makes the story, I would argue, considerably more interesting, and considerably more true to how real human relationships actually function, in all their contradiction and complexity. Nikolai and Isabella were not a villain and a victim. They were two deeply flawed, deeply intelligent people who built a strange, difficult, occasionally destructive, occasionally genuinely loving partnership that lasted for the better part of 30 years, through more public humiliation than most couples in history have ever had to endure. Every pattern, however entrenched, eventually meets the event that either breaks it entirely or forces a permanent change, and for Nikolai that event arrived when he was in his late 40s, well past the age when society expected a man to have settled into respectable middle age. The scandal itself, when it finally broke, involved a matter far more serious than any affair or gambling debt, because this time, the accusations touched not just Nikolai's personal conduct but the very legitimacy of his position and his fitness to hold the responsibilities that came with it. The circumstances began when a business partner, a man Nikolai had entered into a significant financial arrangement with regarding investments in a shipping venture, accused the Duke publicly of deliberately concealing information about the venture's failing prospects in order to induce other investors, including several close friends and even distant relations, to buy in at a moment when Nikolai himself was already quietly withdrawing his own funds. This was not a matter of personal indiscretion that society could shrug off with knowing amusement. This was an accusation of financial fraud, the kind of charge that could result in genuine legal consequences, the loss of his seat in Parliament, and potentially even the loss of the family's remaining fortune through lawsuits from the defrauded investors. For the first time in the entire history of the Ashworth scandals, this was an accusation that Isabella could not simply manage through discreet negotiation or clever investigation, because unlike the previous incidents, this one involved a paper trail, contracts, and financial records that either supported the accusation or refuted it, with no room for the kind of ambiguous, he-said-she-said resolution that had characterized so many of the earlier scandals. The truth would come out one way or another, in a court of law if necessary, and no amount of strategic reputation management could change what the ledgers actually showed. What followed was, by every account, the most difficult period of the entire marriage. Isabella, drawing on financial acumen she had developed over decades of quietly managing the family's affairs, insisted on reviewing every document related to the shipping venture herself, refusing to simply take her husband's word that he was innocent, a demand that Nikolai, in a moment historians consider genuinely significant, did not resist or resent. He handed over every record he possessed and submitted what amounted to an internal investigation conducted by his own wife, an extraordinary reversal of the dynamic that had defined their marriage for the previous 2 decades. What Isabella discovered, after weeks of painstaking review, was a genuinely complicated truth, one that did not fit neatly into either complete innocence or complete guilt. Nikolai had, in fact, learned of the shipping venture's failing prospects before most of the other investors, and had, in fact, begun quietly withdrawing his own funds before that information became public. But the evidence did not support the more serious accusation that he had deliberately concealed this information from other investors in order to profit at their expense. Rather, the truth appeared to be a case of profound negligence rather than deliberate fraud. Nikolai had been so consumed by his own financial anxiety, so eager to protect his own position, that he had simply failed to consider his obligation to inform his fellow investors, a failure of character rather than a calculated scheme, but a serious failure nonetheless. Isabella's response to this discovery is, in many ways, the culmination of everything we have discussed about her role throughout this marriage. She did not shield her husband from the consequences of his negligence. Instead, she insisted that he personally compensate every investor who had lost money in the venture, using funds from the family's own reserves, a decision that significantly strained the estate's finances but that she argued, successfully, was the only path that could preserve what remained of the family's honor and prevent the matter from escalating into the kind of legal battle that could destroy them entirely. Nikolai, remarkably, agreed without significant resistance, a stark contrast to his behavior during every previous scandal of his life. This decision, when it eventually became known, more through Isabella's own careful management of the narrative than through any voluntary disclosure by Nikolai, had an unexpected effect on public opinion. Rather than treating this as simply the latest chapter in a long history of the Duke's misbehavior, a significant portion of society began, for the first time, to view the situation with something approaching sympathy, or at least respect. Here, finally, was a case where the Duke of Ashworth had actually taken responsibility for a genuine failing, at real personal and financial cost, rather than relying on his wife or his rank to make the problem disappear. It did not erase 2 decades of prior scandal, but it marked, in the assessment of nearly every historian who has studied this period, a genuine turning point in how the public understood this man. Change, when it finally comes to a person who has spent their entire life avoiding it, rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. It arrives, more often, as a slow accumulation of small shifts, each one unremarkable on its own but significant in aggregate. This is exactly the pattern that emerges in the final decade of Nikolai's life, as documented through the letters, estate records, and public accounts that survive from this period. The scandals did not stop entirely. It would be dishonest to suggest that the shipping venture incident transformed Nikolai overnight into a paragon of aristocratic virtue. There was, several years later, a final flare-up of gossip surrounding an old rumor from his youth that resurfaced when a memoir by a minor society figure was published, reigniting old speculation about affairs and indiscretions from decades earlier. There was also a genuinely new scandal, though a much smaller one, involving a disagreement with a political rival that nearly resulted in another duel before cooler heads, including Isabella's, intervened. But the frequency and severity of these incidents decreased noticeably, and more importantly, Nikolai's response to them changed in ways that those closest to him found remarkable. Where once he had responded to scandal with either icy denial or restless escape into some new distraction, his letters from this later period show a man increasingly willing to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it. In one particularly telling letter to Isabella, written during the resurfaced rumor controversy, he wrote that he found himself, for what felt like the first time in his life, simply enduring the unpleasant sensation of being talked about without needing to do something, anything, to make the feeling stop. He described this as both agonizing and, in a strange way, liberating, as though he was finally learning a skill that should have been taught to him as a child but never was. Isabella's own letters from this period reflect a cautious, hard-won kind of hope, tempered by decades of disappointment that had taught her not to expect too much too quickly. She writes of small moments, quiet evenings when her husband seemed genuinely present rather than performing, conversations in which he asked about her own thoughts and feelings with what seemed like real curiosity rather than the strategic charm he had deployed throughout most of their marriage. She is careful, in these letters, not to overstate the transformation, noting more than once that old patterns die slowly and that she had learned, through hard experience, not to mistake a good season for a permanent change. But something had genuinely shifted, and the historical record bears this out. Nikolai's final years show a man far more engaged in the actual unglamorous work of managing his estate and his responsibilities than he had been at any previous point in his life. He took a more active role in Parliament, focusing particularly on legislation related to the treatment of tenants and agricultural workers, a cause that estate records suggest was influenced significantly by Isabella's own long-standing concerns about the welfare of the people who depended on the Ashworth lands for their livelihood. He and Isabella traveled together more frequently in these final years, not for the kind of restless escape that had characterized his earlier travels, but for what appears, from their correspondence with friends during these trips, to have been genuine shared enjoyment of each other's company. When Nikolai died, at the age of 61, after a relatively brief illness, the obituaries that appeared in the papers told a story markedly different from the scandal-obsessed coverage that had followed him for most of his adult life. Several acknowledged his difficult reputation directly, refusing to simply erase decades of well-documented indiscretion, but nearly all of them also noted, with what reads as genuine respect, the transformation of his final years, and the evident depth of the partnership he had built with his wife despite, or perhaps because of, everything they had weathered together. Isabella lived for nearly 2 more decades after her husband's death, and it is in these final years of her own life that we get perhaps our clearest window into how she herself made sense of the marriage that had defined so much of her adult life. She did not remarry, despite receiving, according to her own later writings with some amusement, no fewer than 4 serious proposals in the years following Nikolai's death. She took over full management of the Ashworth estate on behalf of their son, the new Duke, and by every account governed it with the same sharp strategic competence she had brought to managing her husband's scandals for 30 years, only now applied openly and without the need for the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that had characterized so much of her earlier life. It was during these final years that Isabella began, quietly and without any apparent intention of publication, to write down her own account of the marriage, filling notebook after notebook with reflections that were only discovered by her descendants long after her death and eventually made available to historians. These writings are, in many ways, the most valuable historical resource we have for understanding the true nature of the scandal that followed the Duke of Ashworth everywhere he went, because they come not from a gossip columnist trying to sell papers, not from a rival trying to settle a score, but from the one person who had witnessed every single moment of it from the closest possible vantage point, and who had, by the time she wrote these reflections, no remaining reason to protect anyone's reputation, including her own. In one passage that historians frequently cite as the clearest summary of her own understanding of the marriage, Isabella wrote that the world had always wanted her story to be simple, a tale of a good woman ruined by a bad man, or alternatively, in the cruder gossip that occasionally circulated, a tale of a cold woman who drove her husband into the arms of other women through her own inadequacy. Both versions, she wrote, were equally false, and equally insulting to the actual complexity of what she and Nikolai had built together. She described their marriage not as a tragedy and not as a triumph, but as something closer to a long, difficult, and ultimately worthwhile argument. The same kind of argument that had first drawn her to him across a crowded ballroom decades earlier, extended across 30 years and every conceivable subject a marriage could touch, from fidelity to finances to the raising of their children to the management of an estate that neither of them had ever fully mastered alone. She wrote, too, with a candor that surprised even the historians who eventually studied these papers, about her own choices and her own culpability in the shape their marriage took. She acknowledged that her early strategy of managing scandal through silence and strategic non-response, while effective in preserving the family's public standing, had also, in her own assessment, enabled her husband to avoid facing the full consequences of his behavior for far longer than he should have. She wondered, in one particularly raw passage, whether a different approach in those early years, one that forced Nikolai to confront the damage he was causing rather than shielding him from it, might have produced the transformation of his final decade far sooner, sparing both of them years of pain that, in her final assessment, need not have been necessary. This kind of unflinching self-examination is precisely what has been missing from every popular retelling of this story for the 2 centuries since it happened, because it complicates the comfortable moral categories that gossip and legend prefer. Isabella was not simply a saint who endured. She made choices, some of them wise, some of them, by her own later admission, mistaken, and she lived with the consequences of those choices for the rest of her life with the same clear-eyed honesty she had brought to every crisis her marriage had handed her. She died at the age of 78, having outlived her husband, most of her contemporaries, and the vast majority of the scandalmongers who had once made a living off her family's misfortune. Her funeral, according to accounts from the time, drew mourners not just from the aristocratic circles she had spent her life navigating, but from tenants and estate workers whose lives she had personally improved through decades of careful management, a testament to a legacy that extended far beyond her role as the wife of a scandalous duke. So what do we actually make of this story, now that we have walked through the whole of it, the affairs and the fabricated accusations, the gambling debts and the fraud, the strategic duchess and the deeply flawed duke, the slow, hard-won transformation of a man who spent most of his life running from himself? I think the temptation, when telling a story like this, is to reach for a tidy moral, something like love conquers all, or people can change if given enough time, or perhaps the cynical alternative, that reputation is destiny and a man's early failures will define him forever regardless of what comes later. But I think the actual lesson here, the one that the full historical record supports far better than any simple moral, is something more uncomfortable and more useful than either of those tidy conclusions. The scandal that followed the Duke of Ashworth everywhere he went was never really a single scandal at all. It was a pattern, built from genuine failures of character, amplified by a gossip-hungry society that profited from his misbehavior, exploited by opportunists who understood that his reputation made him an easy target, and ultimately, slowly, painfully unwound through the persistent, unglamorous work of 2 people who chose, again and again, to remain engaged with each other despite every reason the world gave them to give up. There is no single villain in this story, and there is no single hero either, though Isabella comes remarkably close, not because she was perfect, but because she was consistently, doggedly honest about the reality in front of her, even when that reality was painful, even when the easier path would have been to accept the simple narrative the world wanted to hand her. What strikes me most, having spent so much time with this story, is how much of what we think we know about famous scandals, from any era, tends to flatten exactly this kind of complexity into something more digestible and more satisfying to gossip about, but considerably less true. We want our scandalous dukes to be simply wicked, and our wrong duchesses to be simply saintly, because that story is easy to tell and easy to feel righteous about. But real people, even famous ones, even ones whose lives are documented in extraordinary detail across centuries of surviving letters and records, rarely fit into categories that clean. Nikolai was genuinely, repeatedly cruel in ways that caused real harm to real people, some of whose names have been lost to history entirely because no one thought their suffering was worth recording. And Isabella was genuinely, remarkably strong and clever in ways that the popular version of her story, the silently suffering wife, has always undersold. But Nikolai also genuinely changed, through years of difficult, unglamorous effort, and Isabella genuinely chose her circumstances in ways more active and more complicated than victimhood alone can explain. If there is a lesson here, perhaps it is this. The scandals that follow a person everywhere they go are rarely just about that person. They are about the society that consumes those scandals, the people who benefit from amplifying them, the people who suffer quietly in their wake without ever making it into the official record, and the people who do the hard, invisible work of managing the fallout, work that history is far too quick to erase or minimize simply because it did not happen in public where anyone could see it and gossip about it. The next time you hear about a scandal, whether it happened 200 years ago in a crumbling English country house or 2 hours ago on your phone, it is worth remembering the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, and asking yourself the question that took historians 2 centuries to properly ask about this particular story. What is the version everyone already believes, and how much of it is actually true? There is one more piece of this story that deserves far more attention than it has traditionally received, and that is the experience of the 3 children born to Nikolai and Isabella over the course of their marriage, children who grew up watching their parents navigate this endless cycle of scandal, investigation, and quiet reconciliation from a vantage point no historian or gossip columnist ever had access to. Their eldest son, who would eventually inherit the dukedom himself, was only 8 years old during the house party scandal, and 11 years old when the fabricated illegitimate child accusation nearly tore the family apart. Their 2 daughters, born several years later, grew up in a household where the family name carried a kind of weight that followed them into every schoolroom, every social engagement, every potential marriage negotiation their mother would eventually have to conduct on their behalf. We know a surprising amount about how this affected the children because the eldest son, writing many years later in his own memoirs after he had become duke in his own right, dedicated an entire chapter to what he called the peculiar education of growing up as the son of the most talked-about man in the country. He wrote candidly about the shame he felt as a young boy when other children at his tutoring lessons would repeat rumors about his father that they had overheard from their own parents, rumors he had no way of knowing were true, exaggerated, or entirely invented, and no way of defending himself against without simply making the whole situation worse. He wrote about the strange, quiet strength of watching his mother handle these crises without ever once losing her composure in front of the children, a composure he later realized, once he was old enough to read her private letters, had cost her far more than she ever let on at the time. Perhaps most poignantly, he wrote about a conversation he had with his father when he was around 16 years old, not long after the shipping venture scandal had finally been resolved, in which Nikolai, uncharacteristically, sat his son down and offered something like an apology, not for any single scandal specifically, but for the totality of what the boy had been forced to grow up inside. He told his son that he hoped, whatever else the boy inherited from him, title and estate and name, he would not inherit the particular kind of fear that had driven so much of his own behavior, the fear of ever sitting still long enough to feel something he could not immediately explain away or escape from. It is a remarkable admission for a man of that era and that rank to make his own heir, and it suggests that whatever transformation took place in Nikolai's final years extended beyond his marriage and into his role as a father as well. The daughters, for their part, left behind less direct testimony, as was common for women of their era whose private writings were less often preserved or valued by subsequent generations, but what does survive suggests they absorbed a different lesson from watching their mother operate. Both daughters, according to family correspondence, developed reputations of their own for being unusually sharp, unusually capable, and unusually unwilling to be underestimated by the men in their social circles, traits that more than one letter from family friends explicitly attributed to having grown up watching Isabella outmaneuver crisis after crisis with a combination of intelligence and iron nerve. In this sense, whatever damage the endless scandal did to this family, and there was genuine damage, it also produced, in the next generation, children who carried forward a kind of resilience and clear-sightedness that their mother had been forced to develop out of pure necessity. It is worth taking a moment before we close this story to talk about why the popular version of the Ashworth scandal, the simple tale of a wicked duke and his saintly, suffering wife, persisted for so long, essentially unquestioned, until relatively recent historical scholarship finally began to unravel it. Part of the answer lies in simple archival access. For most of the 2 centuries following Nikolai's death, the family's private papers remained locked away, and the only sources available to anyone interested in the story were the public ones: the gossip columns, the satirical prints, the second-hand accounts recorded in the memoirs of society figures who often had their own reasons for shading the truth in one direction or another. Without access to Isabella's own journals and letters, there was simply no way for anyone to know about her active role in managing crisis after crisis, and so the passive, suffering version of her became the default, repeated by each subsequent generation of writers who had no reason to question it. But there is another reason this simplified version persisted, one that has less to do with available evidence and more to do with what stories we as an audience actually want to hear. A tale of pure villainy and pure victimhood is satisfying in a way that a tale of two flawed, complicated people making difficult choices simply is not. It gives us someone to condemn without reservation and someone to sympathize with without complication. It lets us feel the pleasant certainty of moral clarity, the sense that we know exactly who was right and who was wrong, a certainty that real human relationships, even famous and thoroughly documented ones, almost never actually provide if you look closely enough. Early biographers of the Ashworth family, writing in the decades after Isabella's death, seemed to sense on some level that the full complexity of the marriage did not fit the narrative their readers expected, and rather than complicating that narrative, they simply left out the details that did not fit, whether consciously or not. It was not until the archive was finally opened to academic researchers, decades after the last direct descendant with any personal memory of the couple had passed away, that historians began to piece together the fuller picture we have discussed today. And even then, the process was slow, because reassessing a story that has been told the same way for 200 years requires not just new evidence but a willingness to abandon a version of events that many people had grown genuinely attached to. There is something almost uncomfortable, for readers who love a good scandal, about learning that the wronged wife at the center of the story was not simply a victim but an active, sometimes ruthless strategist in her own right, or that the wicked husband was not simply a villain but a man capable of genuine growth and genuine remorse. It complicates the pleasure of the gossip, even as it makes the actual history considerably richer and more honest. This is, I think, worth sitting with for a moment, because it applies to far more than just one aristocratic family from centuries ago. Every scandal we consume today, whether it involves a politician, a celebrity, or simply someone in our own social circle, comes to us pre-shaped by the incentives of whoever is telling the story, and those incentives rarely align with complete accuracy. The people who benefit from a scandal, whether financially, socially, or simply through the entertainment value of a juicy story, have every reason to flatten complexity into simplicity, to remove the inconvenient details that make the villain more human or the victim more complicated. The story of Nikolai and Isabella of Ashworth survived in its simplified form for 2 centuries not because that version was true, but because it was easier, and because no one with the power to correct it had sufficient reason to do so until relatively recently. If you were to visit the grounds of Ashworth Hall today, you would find a place that wears its history quietly, almost apologetically, as though the estate itself has grown tired of being remembered primarily for scandal rather than for the centuries of ordinary life that took place within its walls. The portrait gallery where Nikolai's likeness hangs also holds paintings of Isabella, commissioned at 3 different points in her life, and if you compare them side by side, you can see, more clearly than any letter could tell you, the transformation we have spent this entire story tracing. The earliest, painted shortly after her marriage, shows a young woman with a barely suppressed smile, as though she is on the verge of saying something clever to the painter. The second, commissioned during the years of the worst scandals, shows a woman of extraordinary composure, beautiful but guarded, her eyes giving away nothing. The third and final portrait, painted in her widowhood, shows something different again, a face that has settled into itself, tired around the eyes but unmistakably at peace, the face of a woman who had finally stopped needing to perform anything for anyone. The estate records from Isabella's years of sole management, preserved in meticulous detail because she insisted on the same rigor in bookkeeping that she had once applied to investigating her husband's scandals, show a woman who used her hard-won authority to make lasting improvements to the lives of the people who depended on the Ashworth name. She expanded the tenant cottages, improved drainage on the farmland that had flooded regularly for generations, and established a small school for the children of estate workers, an institution that, remarkably, continued operating in some form for well over a century after her death. None of this made it into the gossip columns of her own era, because none of it was scandalous, and scandal, as we have discussed at length throughout this video, is simply more interesting to talk about than quiet competence. But it is, in many ways, a more lasting legacy than any of the dramatic events that made her family's name famous in the first place. As for Nikolai, His legacy in the official histories of Parliament remains genuinely mixed, and appropriately so. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all outside of his scandalous reputation, for his later work on tenant welfare legislation, work that historians generally agree was influenced heavily by his wife's priorities and perspective, filtered through his own position and platform. It is, perhaps, a fitting final image for this entire story, a man whose most lasting positive contribution to the world came not from his own initiative but from finally, after decades of resistance, learning to actually listen to the woman standing beside him. We began this story with a portrait in a cold, rarely visited corridor, a face that seems to follow you no matter where you stand. I want to end with a different image, one drawn not from any painting but from a single line in one of Isabella's last letters, written to her granddaughter not long before her death, in which she offered the kind of advice that only comes from a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. She wrote that the world will always try to tell you a simple story about the people you love, a story with clean edges and obvious morals, and that your task, if you are wise, is to refuse that simple story every single time, because the truth, however messy and however much harder to explain at a dinner party, is always the more worthwhile thing to know. That, I think, is the real inheritance of this entire scandal, more valuable than any title or estate. Not a lesson about dukes or duchesses, not really. A lesson about the difference between the stories we are told and the truth underneath them, and about how much richer, how much more human, and ultimately how much more worth telling that underlying truth almost always turns out to be. Thank you for spending this time with me and with the long, complicated, genuinely human story of Nikolai and Isabella of Ashworth. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, let me know in the comments which part surprised you most, because I suspect it will not be the part you expected going in. And if you want more deep dives into the true stories behind history's most famous scandals, the ones that turn out to be far stranger and far more human than the legends ever let on, make sure you are subscribed, because there are many more of these stories waiting to be told properly. Until next time.